Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 12 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After which, we'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, of course, talking about each of these players on an individual basis. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video. You can find timestamps available there. Also, while you're down there, if you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel because besides the daily content, of course, we're live streaming every single day later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you have any questions regarding your Week 12 lineups, potentially waiver wire questions, swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Starting again at 7 p.m. PST. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups at the running back position. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, I've gone ahead and isolated running back rushing statistics allowed from week 6 through 11 because, again, the most recent performances against these defenses are significantly more important as to what happened in week 1 or 2. Therefore, over the course of week 6 through 11, the New Orleans Saints, Commanders, Cowboys, Panthers, Giants, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the running back position, specifically based on rushing statistics isolated. We're talking about rushing yards and rushing touchdowns because the receiving upside of a running back is purely dependent on that quarterback's tendency and the offensive coordinator's willingness to get the running back implicated within that overall category rather than the matchup itself. So when we isolate these statistics, we find that, of course, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take advantage of the Saints matchup as they're on a bye week with another additional 5 teams on top of that. But of course, taking advantage of the Commanders matchup, Cowboys matchup, I mean, again, that's probably going to be a one-sided affair in the favor of the Washington Commanders, considering how the Cowboys have looked as of late. So Brian Robinson Jr., Austin Ekeler in a great position, but someone like Rico Dowdle, even with a fantastic matchup on hand, considering the opportunity share, may not be the greatest overall position. But either way, just wanted to go ahead and share some of the more advantageous matchups going into the given week. Also talk about some of the more disadvantageous ones, like the Rams, the Chargers, the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Dolphins, etc. Really not allowing much to opposing running backs. I mean, the Chargers and Rams, the Los Angeles teams, have not allowed a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back since week 6. So again, we haven't seen a lot of overall success from running backs against them. In terms of yard per carry averages, again, the Los Angeles Chargers allowing over 4.5 per carry. So there's still an opportunity for running backs this week, specifically Derrick Henry, to find himself an abundance of overall success. Either way, we'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. I just wanted to go ahead and gloss over them just to begin with, and we'll go into more detail as we continue. Before we get into today's content in regards to the top 36 running back rankings, I also want to remind you, while you're down in the description looking at the timestamps or potentially subscribing to the channel, if you haven't yet already, be sure to check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, these rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, including the flex position, will be sent from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. But you'll be able to go ahead and claim the first-time deposit offer and potentially tail the upcoming Underdog entries that we make over the course of the week, every Monday, Thursday, and of course with the Hidden Gems episode every Friday. So for those of you interested, be sure to go ahead and check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are not eligible based on your current location, you can always get my rankings via Patreon. Link is down in the description for those of you who want to support. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, with this all covered, let's get into our top 36 running back rankings, beginning with our number 1, Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, even though Christian McCaffrey hasn't scored a touchdown in the last 2 games, he's been extremely successful in terms of his total yardage. He's been able to accumulate 106 and 107 in the last 2 games. So eventually when the touchdowns begin to trickle in, his fantasy overall upside is going to get into that 20-point range, which we all expect him to be at. Of course, he's still trying to, work his way into the season. This almost feels like preseason games for him as he's still trying to get back to a 100% healthy state. But as we progress, we're going to begin to see Christian McCaffrey really begin to elevate. Now, last season against the Green Bay Packers, they took each other on most recently in the NFL playoffs. In that game, Christian McCaffrey, 98 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, 7 receptions, 30 receiving yards, and 28.3 half PPR fantasy points. So we've seen recent success from Christian McCaffrey against this Green Bay Packers defense. And this Green Bay Packers defense over the course of this season thus far, they haven't really been able to stop the run. Since week 6, they're allowing 4.53 yards per carry. They're allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the ground, 16.42 on a per game average. Most recently, they've allowed opposing running backs to accomplish over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown in 4 of the last 5 games against their defense. The expectation is Christian McCaffrey continuing his successful streak and hopefully finding the end zone this week. Number 2, we have Achane of the Miami Dolphins. Look, Achane in the last 6 healthy games with Tua Tagovailoa, 4 or more receptions every single game, with Of course, Raheem Mostert going down with an injury, that means even more potential for upside in that overall category, considering Raheem Mostert has been the number 2 receiving back of this team in comparison to Jalen Wright. So if those opportunities go in the direction of Achane in this circumstance, of course, his upside will continue to grow within that category. Now, over the course of the last 6 games, like we've talked about, besides the 4+ receptions per game, he's been able to surpass 18.5 fantasy points in 5 of those 6 games. He's averaging 20.58 fantasy points per game as long as Tua Tagovailoa is on the field. They have the privilege of taking on the New England Patriots this week, which is the 7th best matchup at the running back position, 17.75 fantasy points per game on the ground, while allowing 4.84 yards per carry on average since week 6. When we go back to week 5, when we saw the Miami Dolphins take on the New England Patriots, unfortunately, Devon Achane sustained an early concussion in that game and had to leave. But after his departure of that overall game, we saw the running backs of the Miami Dolphins accumulate 35 rushing attempts for 184 rushing yards against the New England Patriots. I'm expecting a run-heavy game this week from Devon Achane. Number 3, we have Joe Mixon, who's coming off of a performance last night, which was incredible. I mean, 3 touchdowns is ridiculous, but he continues to do this every single week. In 6 of the last 7 games, he's been able to total 100 or more total yards, and in 7 of the last 7 games, 1 touchdown minimum. In fact, in the last 7 games, he has totaled 11 touchdowns, whether it's on the ground or through the air total, continues to dominate. Since week 7, he's been able to get himself 22 touches per game minimum. As long as he's continuing to get this elite level of opportunity, the touchdowns, the yardage, it's all going to continue to flow in his direction. You would imagine that a player that is in his 8th year in the National Football League and 28 years old at the running back position, considering all the wear and tear that has been on Joe Mixon's body, you would assume that going to the Texans wouldn't have been this much of an upgrade, but he's the best he's ever been in his entire career, and he continues to play while taking on the Tennessee Titans. Should be another great matchup for him this week. Number 4, we have Saquon Barkley. Speaking of another older running back that continues to ball out, Saquon Barkley is coming off of another one of those massive weeks, and that's pretty much what we have found thus far this season. He either has weeks in which he scores touchdowns and dominates it, or on the opposite side of the coin, doesn't score a touchdown because Jalen Hurts is stealing all the rushing upside and unfortunately doesn't have himself as glorious of an overall performance. Now, again, Jalen Hurts has still scored 9 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games. But in the 5 games this season in which Saquon Barkley has been able to score himself a touchdown, again, in those 5 games has scored 10 total touchdowns. So again, whenever he's scoring in bunches. In those games, averaging 30.74 fantasy points per game, while on the opposite side of the coin, in games in which he does not score a touchdown this season, only averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game. This week takes on the Los Angeles Rams, the most difficult matchup at the position, only allowing 7.74 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the ground since week 6, 3.37 yards per carry on average. Yes, it's a difficult matchup considering how great they've been as a run-stop defense, but Saquon Barkley is an elite running back, and we have to start him regardless of the upcoming matchup. Number 5, we have Derrick Henry to close out the S tier. Look, speaking of older running backs, we have Derrick Henry who continues to defy the odds every single week. I want everybody to understand, besides the 11 consecutive games of 1 touchdown minimum and him being an automatic underdog entry every single week, what we are really witnessing every week is historic. What he's been able to accomplish over the course of this season is ridiculous. Again, when you compare this season thus far to his 2020 campaign in which he ran for over 2,000 all-purpose yards, in that season, he was averaging 4.91 yards per carry. Thus far this season, averaging 6.01 yards per carry. Not only that, when you compare the statistics between those 2 seasons, in the first 11 games, when we compare 2020 to 2024, Derrick Henry thus far this season has 59 less rushing attempts in his first 11 games, but only 72 less rushing yards and 1 less rushing touchdown. He is truly on pace to break the numbers and the records that he set in 2020 and honestly continue to get himself one step closer to that gold jacket in Canton. All right, moving on to our number 6. To begin the A tier, we have James Conner. Look, James Conner taking on the Seattle Seahawks is one of the most advantageous matchups, on top of the fact that they are coming off of a much-needed bye week. Over the course of this season thus far, James Conner, again, is averaging 18.3 touches per game on average, which makes him number 14 amongst all running backs within that category. Not only that, but over the course of the last 10 games in which he has played, 8 of those games have consisted of 13 or more fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. To put it into perspective, the only 2 games in which he was not able to accomplish that were games in which they got blown out. But this week, it's not going to be a blowout. And if anything, it's going to be a blowout in their favor. Taking on the Seattle Seahawks is the 8th best matchup. 16.48 half PPR fantasy points per game on ground. Not only that, but they're also allowing 5.28 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 6. If we're going to be in a situation in which James Conner continues to dominate, just like he has most recently, 6 of the last 8 games in which he has participated in, surpassing over 100 total all-purpose yards. But not only that, the last time that he took on the Seattle Seahawks, week 18 of the 2023 season, 150 on the ground, 1 rushing touchdown, 4 catches, 54, all for 28.4 half PPR fantasy points. If that kind of level of production is within the realm of possibility, the A tier in the number 6 rank is at a base minimum. Number 7, we have Josh Jacobs, who continues to play well. And what I exactly mean by that is the last 6 consecutive games he has played, he has gotten himself 90 plus total yards in every single game. Not only that, he has scored 5 total touchdowns in the last 6 total games. So as long as the opportunities continue to go in his direction, I'm anticipating that Josh Jacobs is going to continue to find himself success, the yardage, the touchdowns, etc. Now, obviously, he continues to get himself an exposure within the receiving game, which is very promising. 5 targets, 4 catches, and 58 receiving yards this most recent performance. And as long as that continues to build up, that is going to be incredible. Now, this week they take on the San Francisco 49ers. The last time the Green Bay Packers took on the 49ers, their starting running back in the NFL playoffs was Aaron Jones. In that game, Aaron Jones, 18 carries for 108 rushing yards, 3 receptions for 8 receiving yards, and 13.1 fantasy points. We have seen recently that LaFleur knows how to run the ball against this defense. So going into this upcoming week, considering the 49ers are allowing 14.4 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs, middle of the pack matchup, sure, but I'm anticipating, considering the familiarity with one another, that of course LaFleur is going to set up Josh Jacobs for success for another consecutive week here. Number 8, we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Look, Jahmyr Gibbs every single week should be an automatic start, as we know. He always will have the threat of David Montgomery stealing a potential touchdown upside, but the fact of the matter is this offense has just too much firepower, and they will continue to score. And even in weeks in which sometimes Jahmyr Gibbs will disappear, the next week he'll come out and dominate. Coming off of another consecutive game of getting himself over 100 total yards. He has done that in 6 of the last 9 games he has played. In the last 10 games, he has scored 9 total touchdowns. They take on the Colts this week, which are allowing 4.51 yards per carry on average on the ground and 15.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the ground. The expectation is that number should be doubled up with the efforts of Gibbs and Montgomery, both of them dominating in a one-sided affair. Number 9, to begin the B tier, we have Kyren Williams taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, which quite frankly isn't an easy matchup. They're only allowing 8.27 fantasy points per game. They're the third most difficult matchup in the overall conversation, and only 3.72 yards per carry, which obviously doesn't bode well considering Kyren Williams hasn't scored a touchdown in the last 3 games. But the fact of the matter is, going forward, we're expecting this to be a competitive game. In Los Angeles, with no weather concerns, there should be a complete controlled environment for Matthew Stafford and this offense to execute and hopefully give Kyren Williams opportunities down within the red zone. We've most recently seen running backs against the Philadelphia Eagles, Washington specifically, 75 on the ground for a rushing touchdown. Dallas went for 75 on the ground. Jacksonville only 52 on the ground. Cincinnati 53 and a touchdown. Again, the yardage counts have not been great, mainly because the Eagles take an early lead and force opposing offenses to have to throw the ball. But in this upcoming scenario, hopefully Kyren Williams is going to be given the ample opportunity within the red zone to find success. Number 10, we have Kenneth Walker, who going up against the Arizona Cardinals has himself a very, very promising track record. Over the course of his entire career, in the last 4 games in which he has taken on the Arizona Cardinals, every single timeout has gone for over 80 total yards. So as long as he's going to be in a position in which he's going to be given the opportunity like he typically does, over the course of the last 4 games in which they haven't been completely blown out, he's getting either 16 or 20 plus touches within a singular game. Typically in the games in which they're winning, he gets himself about 16 touches. In the games in which they're losing, because he's getting more receiving upside in those categories, typically it's like 20 plus touches. So within the upcoming matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, who have played incredibly well, and the Seattle Seahawks defense that typically puts them in kind of negative game scripts, if there's going to be a conversation in which Kenneth Walker gets himself more receiving upside, fantastic. Worst case scenario, the Seattle Seahawks come out and they play incredibly well, and that leads to a Kenneth Walker touchdown, which quite frankly is what we're asking for. Nonetheless, regardless of which way this matchup goes in terms of game script, the expectation is that Kenneth Walker will continue to be relevant this week. Number 11, we have David Montgomery. Look, the fact of the matter is I've ranked him relatively low, mainly because I know what kind of fantasy points he's going to score. I mean, he's pretty much a guarantee for 13 fantasy points every single week minimum, mainly because 8 of the last 10 games, he's been able to total over 70 yards and get a touchdown minimum. Again, thus far this season amongst all running backs, he is tied for number 1 in terms of red zone rushing touchdowns inside the 5-yard line. He is tied with Derrick Henry within that category. So as long as the opportunities continue to flow in his direction within that category, the expectation is that he should score a baseline of 13 fantasy points and a half PPR, 70 rushing yards, and of course, the potential of getting himself that singular rushing touchdown. Whatever receiving utilization that he's able to get within the given week is just gravy on top of it. But considering he has such a solidified guarantee, ranking him within the top 12 just seems like an automatic to me, especially considering they're taking on the Colts that are allowing 4.51 yards per carry on average this week. I'm expecting David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs to tear apart this defense from seam to seam. All right, moving on to our number 12, we have Jonathan Taylor. Look, Jonathan Taylor taking on the Detroit Lions is not an easy matchup to say the least, especially considering the fact that the Lions' run-stop defense over the course of the last 2 games have truly clamped up on the Houston Texans and Jacksonville Jaguars. Specifically locking down, Joe Mixon is impressive in comparison to Travis Etienne, which again isn't very difficult to stop considering the offensive line and their efforts within Jacksonville. But when we talk about the potential of Jonathan Taylor this week, understand that last week, prior to Anthony Richardson scoring both of his rushing touchdowns, the play prior to those overall opportunities were Jonathan Taylor rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line. And unfortunately, he was not able to find himself in the end zone. But again, very similar to some of these other running backs who have threatening quarterbacks, such as for example, Saquon Barkley, having to deal with the fact that, of course, Jalen Hurts has scored 9 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games. Jonathan Taylor is going to have that threat. But quite frankly, as we continue, I'm not too worried about it. As long as the opportunities are going to be there in terms of rushing attempts, he's going to eventually break out big runs. He's eventually going to find himself success. I mean, in the last 7 games he has played, 5 of those games consisting of 100 or more total yards. So the opportunities are going to be there. Just needs to go ahead and break out a bigger run instead of having himself a 2-yard per carry average similar to last week. He needs to be a little bit more efficient. And when he is, he will be more fantasy successful within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 13 to close out the beat here, we have Brian Robinson Jr. Listen, Brian Robinson has 7 rushing touchdowns in the last 8 games, and considering the lack of overall upside that Jaden Daniels has presented, considering the rib injury, this is going to be a run-first approach against the Dallas Cowboys. And again, you want to run the ball against the Dallas Cowboys, especially after what we saw last night. Again, Joe Mixon and the Houston Texans, their running backs combined for 111 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. I mean, the Cowboys are the 3rd best matchup, allowing over 20.5 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.85 yards per carry on average. Not only did Houston go over 100, but Philly went over 100, Atlanta went over 100, San Francisco, Detroit, all of them went for over 100 yards minimum against this defense. The expectation is that Brian Robinson's taking advantage of the overall matchup. Number 14, to begin the C tier, we have Bucky Irving. Now, I could see Bucky Irving very easily surpassing this number 14 rank within the upcoming performance, not only because he's been given a great volume of opportunity as of late and has been highly efficient, but because of the matchup. Now, as of late, from week 6 through 10, he's been averaging 10 rushing attempts per game, 3.6 receptions per game, and 13.14 fantasy points per game, while averaging 4.71 yards per carry. And of course, throughout that span of time is included a Kansas City and Baltimore matchup, which are 2 of the most difficult matchups at the running back position. So when you have an opportunity this week of taking on the Giants with Tommy DeVito at quarterback, but a defense that cannot stop the run, allowing 19.7 fantasy points per game, the 5th best matchup, and 5.25 yards per carry on average, they've most recently allowed 158 in a touchdown to Carolina, 114 in a touchdown to Washington, 160 to Pittsburgh, and 247 in a touchdown to the Philadelphia Eagles. With Bucky Irving most recently playing about 40% of the offensive snaps in negative game scripts as of late, we're expecting a one-sided affair in which in a positive game script, he may get himself even more opportunity and even have even more upside for fantasy success. Moving on to our number 15, we have Rhamondre Stevenson taking on the Miami Dolphins. Look, Rhamondre Stevenson against the Miami Dolphins earlier this season, 12 carries for 89 in a rushing touchdown, 4 grabs for 3 receiving yards, and 17.2 fantasy points. We're hoping for that kind of similar level of production. Considering what Drake May has done as of late, he's really elevated this offense to another level, and it has given more value to Rhamondre Stevenson. There's a reason why Rhamondre Stevenson has been able to get himself 20 rushing attempts in 3 of the last 4 games. It's because Drake May has kept them within the upcoming matchups, and they're not getting blown out and having to completely ditch the running game. So going within the upcoming matchup, considering the Miami Dolphins have struggled in terms of stopping the run thus far this season, I'm expecting Rhamondre Stevenson to immediately be a solid option within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 16, we have Isiah Pacheco. Now, again, I don't know the 100% status of Isiah Pacheco, but very similar to what they did earlier this season with Kareem Hunt. When they signed Kareem Hunt, they had him ramp up in practice for an entire week and kept him inactive. Very similar to Isiah Pacheco last week. Practiced all week, but was inactive for the Sunday game against the Buffalo Bills. So going into this week, considering the ramp up, my expectation is that Isiah Pacheco should get back to what he was doing prior to his injury, which, again, prior to injury, 13.6 and 14.8 fantasy points. Taking on the Carolina Panthers just leads to even more potential for upside, considering they are the 4th best matchup at the running back position, allowing 5.18 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. Again, there may be a possibility in which this offense completely blows out the Carolina Panthers, and in that event, we may see a little bit of opportunities for Kareem Hunt late in the game. But in order to go ahead and blow out this defense, I would anticipate Isiah Pacheco to handle 80+% of the rushing attempts in the beginning of this game and eventually find himself in the end zone, very similar to what we have seen out of Kareem Hunt over the course of the last month. Moving on to our number 17, we have J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins and the Chargers take on the Baltimore Ravens. So not only is it a revenge matchup for J.K. Dobbins taking on his former team, Greg Roman, who is the offensive coordinator of the Chargers now, taking on his former team, and Harbaugh taking on his brother. Besides the implications of that on Monday Night Football, we have a matchup taking on the Ravens, which is one of the most difficult at the running back position, only allowing 9.22 fantasy points per game and 3.64 yards per carry on average since week 6. Again, there's been a lot of running backs that haven't found themselves in abundance of overall success against the Baltimore Ravens, and it's not by accident. It's mainly because the secondary of the Ravens has played terribly, and considering the Ravens typically take an early lead, it forces you to have to throw the ball, which we may see this upcoming week. Luckily, of course, J.K. Dobbins gets himself a fair share of opportunity within the receiving game, and luckily, he's been able to score himself 6 rushing touchdowns in the last 6 games. So when they get down into the red zone, they're going to give him the opportunities that are, of course, the most valuable at the running back position. It should be a competitive matchup, and hopefully, J.K. Dobbins continues his streak of success. Number 18, to close out the C tier, we have Najee Harris, who most recently took on the Baltimore Ravens, speaking of, in regards to J.K. Dobbins. But, this most recent performance was great. Got himself a lot of receiving utilization, total yards on the ground, again, 63 through the air, 30 receiving yards. Great overall performance. In the lack of a touchdown, still getting double-digit fantasy points is very promising. Now, in the last 5 games in which he has played, he's been able to surpass 11 or more fantasy points every single week throughout that span of time, averaging 14.52 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. He's averaging 20 touches per game since week 6, and as long as the opportunities continue to go in his direction, expected to be a snow game on this upcoming Thursday's matchup against the Cleveland Browns, this should be a run-first effort. Now, even though the Browns are only allowing 3.92 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs, we have most recently seen the following performance against the Cleveland Browns. Henry, 73 and 1 touchdown. Dobbins, 85 and 2 touchdowns. Kamara for 67 on the ground. But in that same game, Taysom Hill, 138 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. If it wasn't for Taysom Hill's efforts, we would have seen Kamara's overall potential increase significantly. Either way, I think Najee Harris, a fantastic play within the upcoming matchup. Moving on to our number 19, we have Aaron Jones. Taking on the Chicago Bears is one of the easiest matchups you could possibly ask for, allowing over 15.3 fantasy points per game, 4.84 yards per carry on average. Most recently, we have seen Green Bay running backs, 93 and a touchdown, New England, 120 on the ground, Arizona, 205 and 2 touchdowns on the ground. So Aaron Jones, who has yet to score a touchdown since week 7, is hopefully going to get himself more opportunity. Now, even though this most recent performance, he was stuffed on the 1-yard line, he could have easily scored a touchdown. The opportunities are certainly going to be there for Aaron Jones. It's just a matter of, is he able to act upon the opportunities and find an abundance of overall fantasy success? And with Cam Akers getting himself more and more touches every single week, it begins to kind of lower the overall potential for upside for Aaron Jones within that category. Moving on to our number 20, we have Chuba Hubbard. I still believe that Chuba Hubbard has weekly value in fantasy, even though they do take on the Kansas City Chiefs, which is one of the most difficult matchups at the position. Again, only allowing 3.11 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. Again, this is not going to be an easy approach for Chuba Hubbard, but I expect a slow integration of Jonathon Brooks. And because of that, it should lead to Chuba Hubbard finding success. Let's not forget, this is a running back from weeks 2 through 10, is averaging 5.19 yards per carry, has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 9 games, and has been the number 4 overall running back in fantasy football and number 10 in terms of fantasy points per game on average. So even though he has a very difficult upcoming matchup, again, we have seen running backs from Buffalo, Baltimore, Tampa Bay, and Atlanta. The running back tandems within those backfields combined for over 15 fantasy points plus in their games against the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, that's not just rushing statistics, that's all-encompassing statistics, including receiving yards and etc. So when we take into account that there have been backfields that have found success against this defense, there's a possibility that Chuba Hubbard, if he finds himself in the end zone, could be a significantly higher rank than number 20 within the upcoming performance. Number 21, we have Tyrone Tracy. Look, I don't know what exactly this offense is going to look like with Tommy DeVito in comparison to having the overall upside of someone like Daniel Jones. But again, as we progress, we're talking about a running back who over the course of the last 5 games in which he has played as the full-time starter is averaging 20 touches per game and 16.6 fantasy points per game. So the number 21 rank may be incredibly low, but again, I still want to wait and see what I'm going to see out of this offense, especially when you consider from weeks 1 through 10 of this season, the offense as a whole has been running the ball 19.6 attempts per game, 4.6 targets per game for their running backs, and 15.82 fantasy points per game from the running backs. In comparison to last season in 2023, from weeks 9 through 15, with Tommy DeVito as our starting quarterback, only 16.5 rushing attempts per game, more targets per game, 5.83, and a little bit less fantasy points per game, 15.52. If this offense is going to regress because of Tommy DeVito, then I would assume that Tyrone Tracy would be the first man up to regress as well. But nonetheless, going into this week, it is a solid matchup against Tampa Bay. Again, they're allowing 4.58 yards per carry on average, and considering the volume of opportunity Tyrone Tracy has received, as long as they continue to hand him off the ball, again, he's going to put himself into a position to be a top 20 plus running back, and hopefully, with a touchdown, get himself into that top 15 conversation by week's end. Moving on to our number 22. Speaking of touchdowns, we have Rachaad White. Rachaad White has scored 1 touchdown in each of the last 4 games minimum. I mean, from week 7 through 10, throughout those last 4 games, only averaging 7.25 rushing attempts per game, has been averaging 5 receptions per game and 19.08 fantasy points per game with a 4.1 yard per carry average. Over the course of those last 4 games, has ranked as RB2, 20, 5, and 7. So if we're going to be in the range of being the low-end RB2 or a top 5 potential running back, I mean, if that's the realm of possibility, taking on the Giants, which is the 5th best matchup at the position, kind of implies that there's a potential which Rachaad White and Bucky Irving should be able to dominate and hopefully both coexist as they have over the course of the last month of the season. Again, besides the Giants being the 5th best matchup and allowing 5.25 yards per carry on average, they've allowed over 110 rushing yards and a touchdown the last 4 teams that they have played against on the ground. The expectation is a lot of success for Rachaad White this week. Moving on to our number 23. We have Tony Pollard. The expectation is that Tyjae Spears, who has been confirmed to have sustained a concussion on Sunday, he's probably going to be out with a concussion protocol. In the last 4 games in which Tony Pollard has played without Spears, averaging 13.48 fantasy points per game and 23 touches per game. This is an opportunity for Tony Pollard to come out and ball out, especially considering in the last 4 games he has only scored 1 touchdown. Hopefully, he's going to be given enough ample opportunity to find himself in the end zone against Houston. Then we move on to our number 24, DeAndre Swift. Now, even though DeAndre Swift really can only find himself touchdown upside in scenarios in which he's making big runs, mainly because Roschon Johnson is stealing the goal line work, as we have seen over the course of this entire season. Luckily for DeAndre Swift, he has the home run hitting ability still. Over the course of the last 5 touchdowns he has scored, 3 of them have consisted of a 39, a 56, and a 36 rushing yard touchdown, which again, most recently against the Green Bay Packers was able to accomplish that. So as we progress, hopefully he's going to be able to have these home run hitting plays. But with Caleb Williams running the ball as much as he did on Sunday, 9 rushing attempts, it leads to less target opportunity for DeAndre Swift and lowers his overall baseline of production. Taking on the Minnesota Vikings also isn't an easy matchup, but hopefully going into this week will continue to find himself the opportunity to hit those home runs. Moving on to our number 25, we have Javonte Williams. Again, the lesson has been learned. Do not listen to Sean Payton. That's it. We cannot trust his word. Going forward, it's going to potentially continue to be Javonte Williams, or they may flip back to Audric Estime. Who knows? But going into this week, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, it is an advantageous matchup to say the very least, especially considering earlier this season, in the game in which, of course, Javonte Williams took on the Las Vegas Raiders, he had himself 13.6 fantasy points, 13 carries on the ground for 61, 5 catches for 50. If the opportunity share is going to continue to be there, very similar to this most recent performance, in which he played 52% of the snaps, was able to get himself 9 rushing attempts in comparison to Audric Estime's 4. If the opportunities are there, and he's going to continue to be efficient, expect him to be a solid potential start within the upcoming performance. Number 26, we have Nick Chubb. Now look, Nick Chubb was highly efficient in his overall touches. Of his 11 total rushing attempts on Sunday against the New Orleans Saints, 6 of those 11 rushing attempts led to 5 or more rushing yards. So as long as the opportunities are going to be there, he's going to be great. But the unfortunate nature is a Jameis Winston-led Browns offense is throwing the ball over 40 times per game every single week. And considering there is an expectation for potential snow, hopefully it'll lead to more touches for Nick Chubb, but also he's dealing with the recovery of coming back from this knee injury. It is a short week going from a Sunday game to a Thursday night matchup. Hopefully they're going to run the ball more, but considering Jerome Ford doubled up the overall snaps that Nick Chubb played this most recent week, again, there's a possibility in which he isn't given enough opportunity to find himself an abundance of fantasy success, even though the Steelers are the 10th best matchup, allowing 4.44 yards per carry on average and 6.4 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Even with that all being the case in the potential of a snow game, I still don't trust Nick Chubb because this offense is a pass-first attack. Moving on to our number 27. We have Jaylen Warren. Look, Jaylen Warren, over the course of the last 4 games, has been averaging 11 attempts per game, 3 targets per game, and 7.78 fantasy points per game in a half PPR. He's pretty much going to get himself anywhere between 7 to potentially 9 fantasy points, which is beautiful because in the last 4 performances has ranked as RB 33, 37, 23, and 24. So within that overall range, if we're going to find him, on average being like RB 27, he's a solid start every single week as an RB 3 or a potential flex option, especially for those of us who are dealing with a bipocalypse. Considering this upcoming matchup is expected to be a snow shower, if in fact it begins to snow and it becomes a run-first approach, expect the Pittsburgh Steelers to impose their will, not only with Najee Harris, but also with Jaylen Warren. Number 28, we have Rico Dowdle. Now, like I mentioned earlier, even though Rico Dowdle has himself the second best matchup at the running back position this week, Earlier this week, we had comments from Mike McCarthy specifically saying that Rico Dowdle is going to be the guy. He's going to be the full-time back. And then all of a sudden, we see a bunch of workload go in the direction of Ezekiel Elliott. Either way, we really can't trust a lot of these coaches with their comments. Therefore, going forward within the upcoming matchup, again, unless he's going to be given an ample volume of opportunity to the point to where he's getting 15 plus touches, like 10 on the ground, 5 through the air, unless that kind of opportunity share is going in his direction, he's a very difficult start every single week considering the offense he's associated with. Moving on to our number 29, we have Austin Ekeler. Even though Austin Ekeler is coming off a week in which he had 10 touches, he had 9 targets and 8 receptions. Understand that that is an anomaly in terms of the overall workload of what we have seen from Austin Ekeler this season within the receiving game, and additionally, the running backs of the Washington Commanders. Prior to week 11, the running back total targets from the weeks prior, 2-5-4, 2-5-2-4-3. Nothing even remotely close to getting 9 targets. Yet this most recent game was desperate need of a check down considering the pass rush was getting after him. Going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against Dallas, again, the third best matchup at the position, I would assume that in garbage time, Austin Ekeler is going to get himself enough rushing opportunity to be relevant even without receiving upside. Moving on to our number 30, we have Ameer Abdullah. Now, if we're going to be in a situation in which Ameer Abdullah is going to be given the full reign of this backfield in the absence of Alexander Mattison and Jahmyr White, considering they both sustained injuries on Sunday, then of course he's a solid option because, again, he is a starting running back of this offense. In the event in which Alexander Mattison or Jahmyr White are healthy and playing, they would take his overall position here as the number 30 overall spot. Regardless of who it is, whoever the starting running back of the Raiders is going into this weekend, they'll sit at number 30 going into the week. Moving on to our number 31, we have Kareem Hunt. Like I talked about earlier, there may be a slow ramp up in terms of the overall opportunity share going in the direction of Pacheco, but I do anticipate Pacheco to dominate, especially considering they take on the Carolina Panthers. So if we're going to be in a situation in which garbage time potentially presents itself, Kareem Hunt could still be a viable option, just in the same way in which we have seen Samaje Perine, even with Kareem Hunt being the starting running back, be fantasy relevant. There's an opportunity available here for Kareem Hunt to, in garbage time, find himself opportunities and hopefully find himself in the end zone for those of us who are in desperate need of it. Moving on to our number 32, we have Roschon Johnson. Speaking of an RB2 finding themselves in the end zone, he's been able to find himself in the end zone in 4 of the last 7 games. Again, amongst all Bears, leads the team in terms of red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line and leads them in terms of red zone rushing touchdowns as well within that category. Therefore, again, if the opportunities are presented, he should be at least 6 to 8 points, has the potential of double-digit fantasy points within the upcoming performance if he's efficient with his overall touches. Moving on to our number 33, Cam Akers. Speaking of efficiency, since joining the Minnesota Vikings, he hasn't been efficient, but in the last 2 games has been given 10-plus attempts each of those games. Has an opportunity of taking on the Bears, the 13th best matchup, over 15 fantasy points per game on the ground. If there's a possibility in which Aaron Jones doesn't find the end zone, the next man up in order to do so would be Cam Akers, which again, in garbage time, will be given opportunities, especially if in fact they blow out the Bears this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 34, we have Jerome Ford. Like I mentioned earlier, with Nick Chubb having a quick turnaround from Sunday to Thursday game, they might want to take it easy with him in terms of the overall touches. If this is going to be a snow game, expect a healthy share of opportunities going in the direction of Jerome Ford, which will make him fantasy relevant. Moving on to our number 35, Trey Benson. Look, he has been able to get himself 10 touches in each of the last 2 games. If they blow out the Seattle Seahawks, or even if they don't blow out the Seattle Seahawks, there are opportunities that will be sent in the direction of Trey Benson to still keep him fantasy relevant. It is a relatively thin week considering there are 6 teams on bye. So again, we're talking about backups for the majority of this conversation from 30 and beyond. Then we move on to the final running back. Speaking of another backup, we have Jonathon Brooks, which again, like I mentioned earlier, this is going to be his first NFL game. I don't expect much, especially considering they take on Kansas City and considering how well Chuba Hubbard has played in the absence of Jonathon Brooks. Therefore, the number 36 overall rank is mainly just, I don't want to start him. If I have to, I will. But I kind of want to wait, see what he's capable of, and in the following weeks, potentially utilize him within my lineup, depending on his overall opportunity share within this backfield. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 36 rankings for week 12 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be back later tonight starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Subscribe, click the like button. Of course, click the bell notification button to know when I am live. And of course, if you have not yet already, and if you want my rankings, you can either find that via Underdog and or potentially find it via Patreon. Links down in the description. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.